I know, they're like students on my a couple of trips I've done on that, really tiring. And I was away from
I wouldn't see it as a great thing. Our friend of mine who did this, she was brilliant. She became the associate for, I think, like marketing courses and something. But literally she was away Far East, interesting. She's selling the whole country. And that's she was really
well, yeah, give it a few more minutes.
Yeah, they will cross in front of the camera though.
Probably going to be going away. Start realising where I want to make the most of it. Sitting over here.
Well, that's good because the other
You sit over there, please.
use what I bought for you.
Very small.
yeah.
And there were languages.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little light.
Sit over here because otherwise it might be tricky. You as well. Maybe sit over there.
Sorry, thanks. That's one of them as well. Spot to
So can I ask you to start?
Colin worked there for about 10 years.
I'll stand over there. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, a warm welcome to this year's Arts and Humanities Prokhorov lecture organized by the School of Languages and Cultures. My name is Henk Berg, and I'm one of the two directors, together with Evgeny Dobrenko, of the snappily titled Prokhorov Center for the Study of Central and Eastern European Intellectual and Cultural History. And in this context, I also want to mention my colleague Phil Swanson in Hispanic Studies, who's also helped organize this event. It's most gratifying to see that there are so many colleagues from the Faculty of Arts and Humanities here, and I wish to take this opportunity to welcome in particular our head of school, Penny Simons over there, the faculty's Pro-Vice Chancellor, Jackie Labby, and the university's Deputy Vice Chancellor, Shira West. Thank you for coming. I apologize if that sounds a little bit like the thank you part from an Oscar award ceremony. I will say a few words about our distinguished speaker, the German-born American Ulrich Gumbrecht, but don't worry, it will be just a few words. Ulrich Gumbrecht, or Sepp Gumbrecht as he's usually called, is one of the true maîtres à penser of our time. Currently the Albert Gerard Professor in Literature at Stanford. He obtained his first chair at the University of Bochum, Sheffield's twin city, at the tender age of 26. There's a wonderful story, I don't know whether the story is true or not, but there's a wonderful story about how Sepp arrived for his one and a half hour interview for that chair in Bochum in 1974, only to inform the interview panel that unfortunately he had only 25 minutes available for the interview, as he had tickets for a World Cup football match.
It was holiday.
If anyone thinks that this means that Sepp is, to quote a former American Speaker of the House, an arrogant SOB. I can assure you that such is not the case. I can say this on the basis of my own experience, because I attended several of Zeb's classes at the University of Siegen, at which Zeb taught after Bochum and before joining Stanford. But there's also another story which proves this. After having been at Stanford for several years, Zeb once stayed at a hotel in Germany, and the receptionist kept calling him Herr Professor Gumbrecht, because this is how Zeb's name was stored in the receptionist's computer. Zeb was rather embarrassed by this and asked the receptionist whether the professor bit couldn't be deleted from the database. There then followed a lengthy discussion because the receptionist wouldn't budge. Herr Professor Gumbrecht had worked for the title, Herr Professor Gumbrecht deserved the title, so that Herr Professor Gumbrecht ought to be called Herr Professor Gumbrecht. So that Zeb saw only one way out. He told the receptionist, "But you see, I'm only a professor at an American university." Upon which the receptionist immediately relented, saying, "Oh, I see, well, that's different. I shall delete your title from my database right away." I actually stole that story from one of Zeb's books. Be that as it may, and joking aside, Zeb Gumbrecht is one of today's leading scholars and most eminent public intellectuals. Fluent in French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian, he is an outstanding Romance scholar who has published, among other things, a study of the use of rhetoric in the French Revolution and a 2-volume history of Spanish literature. He's also made major contributions to literary theory in books such as The Powers of Philology. A huge sports fan, Zeb has also written extensively on the aesthetics and philosophy of sport. Today his topic is of a more general nature, the future of the humanities, and with that I'm handing you over to our speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, please welcome Ulrich Gumbrecht.
Thank you, dear Henk. I swear these anecdotes are true. I mean, for the native speakers of German, or native speakers, I mean, those who know everyday German, what the receptionist exactly said, I found was much more German, because he lowered the stylistic level. So, aber Sie haben das verdient, Herr Professor, Sie haben sich das erarbeitet, bla bla bla. Er said, ja, aber ich bin doch nur an einer amerikanischen Universität. And then he said with the broadest Berlinese accent, ach so. as if I had pretending. Okay. Well, thanks, Henk. I mean, I kind of like to, as long as I'm alive, I like to live in anecdotes. I mean, it sounds like I'm already dead. I like to be remembered in anecdotes. But yes, they were both true, and I have to insist. I mean, the game that I watched at Dortmund, the city next to Bochum, where I had applied, was actually a game of the legendary 1974 Dutch soccer team. And it is among my scars for life that this Dutch soccer team of 1974 with the late Johan Cruyff lost in a final against a completely mediocre West German team. It was really, I mean, horrible. But I'm not going to talk about this. While I have to say, I mean, first of all, thanks for the invitation to Sheffield. At Cambridge, the porter of Pembroke College told me, do you know that Cambridge is the Rome, that Sheffield is the Rome of the North? You've all heard that. And I said, why? And it's built on 7 hills. I didn't have the time yet since I arrived yesterday to count the hills, but I trust it's going to be 7. But I learned from Genia, actually, that the first, and I'm going to say soccer because I'm an American football fan, soccer team ever was founded in Sheffield. That makes me very, very excited. Being also very happy that Bayern München got eliminated yesterday. Like most Bavarians, I hate Bayern. But I mean, thanks for inviting me here. It's a beautiful city. May it be the Rome of the North. It is definitely the city with the first soccer club. Also, as this is a Prokhorov lecture, I would not like to start without thinking of our friend, our much admired and beloved Irina Prokhorova, we will have back here at Sheffield soon, who is one of the intellectuals, one of the colleagues in a way, whom I really admire the most. And I'm not saying that because my honorarium will be paid by Prokhorov donation. It's really true. And who has made me the present of an intellectual presence in Russia and in Eastern Europe, which is absolutely beautiful. Now, after some typical email back and forth between Evgeny, Henk, and myself, about what topic could be appropriate for today, I think I didn't really impose a topic about the future of the universities upon you. So this was what we found out could be interesting for you. I mean, we don't know each other. I hope it is something that interests you, but thank you for your presence on what I hear is an unusually beautiful Sheffield afternoon. By California standards, a little bit muggy, but it is still beautiful. So this will be mainly about European universities today and in the future, and I will try to tackle this topic. So what's the state? What's going on in European universities today? From three different perspectives. One perspective will be, what else could you expect, an American perspective? I mean, I've been teaching at Stanford for almost 27 years now. That's much more natural for me to be in an American academic environment. Secondly, I want to thematize this question, what can we say about the state of the European universities today from a historical perspective? I'm mainly referring to Wilhelm von Humboldt, but Wilhelm von Humboldt being a representative of a foundational age of the modern university. And finally, I will ask the question, I take it that most of you are from the humanities and arts, what can the role of the humanities and arts be in assuring a future to the university? So this is not the typical apologetic third part by saying humanities are not as bad as you think. They may be, and I actually think if we don't allow ourselves as humanists to think, to imagine a world without the humanities, they will not survive. I think it's a very tough question. I think they're really threatened. Sometimes I think for all the right reasons, if you forgive me that. We can say, okay, he's close to retirement, he can afford to say things like that. It's a very serious question, but that's not my angle. My angle is, what could the contribution of the humanities be, ideally, for a different university? Now, let me start with a diagnostic. This is not yet part of the lecture, so it's like a snapshot. It's not really diagnostic. It would be a very still making photos being made snapshot, and that's okay. Once I don't think about it, I like being photographed. So, okay, diagnostic or snapshot, how could one describe the present day, so May 4th, 2016, situation of European university? I forgot to say one thing. I'm mainly referring to continental European universities. Why? Well, because I know them better. My home away from home in the UK is Cambridge, which I love, which I admire greatly, and Cambridge will be part of what I have to say. I'm a little bit familiar with the University of Manchester, but I don't have as well circumscribed an idea what could be the profile, the average profile, not average in a bad sense, of a UK university as I have for the continent. So I would be thankful in the Q&A if what I'm assuming about British universities is not correct, if you help me to develop a more differentiated picture. In what follows, I will say European, and you realize it is empirically more continental European, but I hope it mostly includes the English perspective. Okay, 5 parts of the snapshot. Diagnostic today. In the first place, I think we can say that the European universities today have made come true, have realized a long-term social democratic promise. And if I'm saying social democratic promise, I'm not referring to any particular party. I'm referring to what I consider to be the state of social politics in the EU today. I mean, and this still includes the UK by any means. Meaning that I think compared, for example, to America, there is something like a social democratic common denominator in the EU that is independent of which party, whether we have Tory or Labour government, whether we have Christian democratic or social democratic government in Germany. And that promise is that studying at a university, at an academic institution, has become a normal expectation for somebody born in the EU. It's nothing special to go to the university. I mean, it's nice that people sometimes still think it's special, and some people say, oh, I'm the first academic, the first person who go to university, my family. But it has become part of the normal expectation, which is a triumph, without any doubt. Whether people are always individually happy with it, and I'm not going to go into this question, it's a different question. I mean, maybe too many people have been lured to the university, but this promise has come true. Whether this is good for the national economies and for the European economy is yet another question. Some of you may know that at this point, Switzerland, for example, is trying to reduce the number of people who go to academic institutions, not to even exclude them, but because they think it's bad for their income, for their individual income, and it's also bad for the national economy. I mean, that is a different question, but quite interesting. Secondly, and that's more pessimistic, I think in spite of goal-oriented and laborious efforts of reform, one can empirically say, for example, about Germany that since the mid-1960s, I started studying in the fall of 1967 and first went to university, German university has been constantly in transformation of reform. Yeah? I mean, there have always been university reform. Some federal country always has a reform. Recently in Germany, but in other countries, there was a so-called Exzellenzinitiative, Excellence Initiative. Altogether, it doesn't seem to have helped much. I mean, if you look at world rankings, for example, European universities are not better positioned than 40 years ago, rather worse actually. Not only in comparison to American universities, but also in comparison to Asian universities, to Australian universities, who, as some of you may know, are on the rise. I mean, University of Sydney, Canberra, and so forth, and so forth, very highly ranked, and I think for all the right reasons. So it hasn't helped. And I would actually say, as far as the humanities are concerned, at this point, we do not have these natural centers of excellence as they used to exist in the late 20th century. I mean, for example, academically based, Paris was an absolute intellectual powerhouse in the 1970s, 1980s. Regardless of whether you liked or hated Derrida's work, but there was Derrida, there was Deleuze, there was Foucault, there was Lyotard, etc., etc. It was very, very powerful, and there is no such place in Europe at this point. I think, including your top universities close to London. So, in that sense, nothing has improved. I hope Evgeny would agree with me that the Eastern universities have not picked up yet. I mean, interesting project. I mean, in Germany they thought that the Humboldt University, which was in East Berlin, before unification, would become now the #1 European university, and they are light years away from it. It has really not worked out, in spite of much good intention and even more investments. Thirdly, that's again more descriptive, European universities tend to define themselves and tend to be institutions that emphasize transmission of professionally relevant knowledge. Yeah? In German you say Ausbildungsinstitutionen. That's their glory. So if you can say, okay, we prepared so and so many people for so and so many professions, that's good. And that is certainly as far away from what is the idea of college in the American sense of college in the slightly different sense of Oxbridge, which is an idea of studium generale. I mean, you're supposed to become a cultivated person. No, I mean, a cultivated person, I'm not saying any university administrator in Europe is going to tell you, yeah, that's a nice idea, but it's unrealistic for today. Which also means, as a tendency, that in Europe, much more than in the United States, professors who are regarded to be excellent are oftentimes, as we say in Spanish, exonerated from teaching obligations. Right? Once again, the German case, if you're very, very good, you will end up being assigned to Max Planck Institute and have no teaching at all. And that means that for Germany, you could say that more than half of the most qualified professors, researchers, and so forth, are isolated from the student body. Fourth, you all know that, and everybody complains about that, and it's the truth. I mean, university administrations both in terms of numbers and in terms of costs, have grown almost exponentially, not really exponentially, in Europe, and they have not improved the university systems. I mean, I actually think if I compare it to my 67 to 1971 time as a student, it is endlessly more difficult if you are in a British university to study in Spain or in Portugal or in Germany today, because you have all these conventions, than it used to be when I decided to study at the University of Salamanca in 1969. I just decided to drive to Salamanca and enroll. And then I enrolled in Salamanca, and there was no problem. I mean, maybe, you know, if Generalissimo Franco had known of my presence, he would have been it didn't. So, I mean, it would be an interesting question to say, what have these administrations done? I'm normally not phobic with administrators. I'm grateful and I can admire good administrators. But it's not clear what the effect of all these regulations, especially EU regulations, has been. And finally, and this is more an atmosphere, a Stimmung, as you say in German, I think the Stimmung, the climate, the feeling about the university today, the university 2016, after all these efforts of reform, is tendentially similar to the feeling about the EU. There's nothing catastrophic going on. I cannot say that, I mean, for the continent especially, that this is the worst moment ever in the EU, but I was at Luxembourg 3 or 4 weeks ago. There's a general dysphoria, I would describe it. I mean, nobody can really get excited about it, nobody can get enthusiastic about it, nobody openly says, you know, we should have never gotten that started, but you don't hear people dreaming of what this could end up being. Now, some of you may say this is not an adequate description, it's definitely too short, but that's my starting point. I mean, let's see, you know, maybe if at this point you think this is completely off, you better leave. I will not come back to this point, but this is a starting description. Now, what do I want to do in the, let's say, 40 minutes or so to follow? The lecture will have 3 parts, and I'll start with what I would like to call unpleasant truths. The much more interesting concept is pleasant truth. When people talk about truths, I would say they're unpleasant, yes. Then banal, these will be unpleasant truths. And this is a comparison of European universities with the best American universities. I mean, there is no United States university system. There is a couple of fantastic universities. Some people in a certain kitsch fashion call them the crown jewels of the United States. I mean, I'd love to be part of the crown jewel. But there's a comparison, and why, and that's statistically true, except for 3 European academic institutions, European institutions are falling behind in comparison to the best American university. Not to the American university, that does just not exist. And we may have more than half of the top universities in the world in the United States. We also definitely have the 2,000 worst universities in the world. I mean, so there is no university system. That's, so from this perspective of the best American university comparison. Second will be, and this is the second part, is going to be the shortest part. What can you say about the European universities today if you hold them against the background of Wilhelm von Humboldt's conception of the university? Now, people normally say, yeah, this is very beautiful what Humboldt said, but it's really unrealistic today. I think it is very realistic. I do think these are ideas that people should take seriously and not eliminate by saying, well, this was 1810, but we cannot do that today. And then finally, I will, and this is going to be the longest part. Normally, my third parts are shorter because I get exhausted. But this is going to be the longest part, and that's the question: what can the humanities do in this context for the universities in Europe and at large? Okay, now comes the moment where I should really say how long this is going to be. Difficult to say. I mean, Henk says he's going to start frowning if it's going to get very, very long. It depends a little bit on the hermeneutics of your faces. Yeah? I mean, now you have this benign look and you're friendly enough to laugh my little jokes. If that happens, I get loquacious and it's getting rather longer. If you look at me like most German audiences look at me, namely pumpig, if you know that word, like with stone faces, then I get very, very embarrassed to start skipping things. It's going to be short. But whatever it will end up being long or short. The responsibility is completely yours. Okay, first the unpleasant truth, the rankings. About a year ago, I was invited by a Swiss magazine, and you will see they knew why, to analyze excellent situation worldwide based on rankings. So as I'm terribly bad with statistics, I had a research assistant, a student majoring in statistics at Stanford, which is seemingly an excellent department. The first surprise was he told me that there are about 250 world rankings of universities. And the more astonishing thing was, he said 150 of them are methodologically absolutely serious. It's not like you can eliminate them easily. So I said, okay, can you then do this basic thing, evaluate the 150 and answer me certain questions? Now you may say immediately, and that's a reflex academics have, well, rankings are relative. I think one has to take rankings seriously for two reasons. Saying this at a university is always very highly ranked, it's easy to say that, but A, the results are astonishingly convergent. This 150, it's not always number one, it's not always the same. Sometimes Harvard, sometimes Stanford. But they are very consistent. They're very, very, very coherent. For example, to give one example, because here's somebody who's a graduate from Ohio State, that Ohio State has risen enormously in the inner American rankings in the last couple of years, in the last 10 years, is reflected in practically any of those 150 rankings. And Ohio State is not yet a top university. Yeah, they are good. And secondly, and that is more important, and I'm using a word that administrators like to use now, universities are brands. We do know statistically that the top-notch students internationally, those students that you want to attract, that we want to attract, that Cambridge wants to attract, that Humboldt wants to attract, they do take rankings very seriously. So, even if you said the rankings are nothing worth, but it is something to be taken into account. Okay, so the simple question I asked my RA to give me an answer, are there any institutions that appear in the top 20 of all these 150 serious rankings? And there are indeed 6 institutions that she found out were in all rankings, and I give you those 6 institutions in alphabetical order. That is Caltech, California Institute of Technology, south of LA, the University of Cambridge, Harvard, the other Cambridge, MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the University of Oxford, and lo and behold, Stanford. So these 6 appear very high in all rankings. Actually, my RA told me they're always top 10, but I want to be cautious and say, because I cannot even control the results. Then I said, okay, 150 rankings, and you allow for 5 exceptions. So universities who normally appear in the top group, but in 5 out of 150 rankings is almost not significant, they do not appear. And this is again 6, but we didn't want them to be 6, but it turns out there are 6 of them. The first one hurts me because this is our competitor at Stanford. University of California, Berkeley is always, no, I like Berkeley, secretly. Then secondly, the University of Chicago. Thirdly, Columbia University in New York. Fourth, that may surprise you, doesn't surprise me, Helvetian Technical University at Zurich, as the Swiss are saying, ETH. Yeah. And Princeton and Yale, obviously. Now, this is not good for Europe. This are 12 institutions, so now unify them in one group. 9 are American. And I would say it is even worse because, of course, structurally there's a similarity between Oxford, Cambridge, and the American model, and that is college. Once again, I know that college education at Oxbridge is not exactly the same as at Yale, Princeton, or Stanford. And yet this specific attention to undergraduates, the component of mentoring, the component that you are obliged and expected to learn things that are not part of your professional education. You could say the only exception, the only university that does not do that and is in this top group is the Helvetian Technical University in Zurich. All the others, including Oxbridge, are of that type. And I'm not saying the American university. Our universities that have this college basis. Now, what we were looking for, this was now my interpretation, what are the features that these top universities share? It's not so obvious. I mean, okay, they're all famous names, and there was no big surprise, except I hope for some of you the ETH was a surprise. Now, 5 features. These are all universities that have programmatically tried to develop their own, oftentimes local profile. They have not been tried to be part of a system. They have not been tried to be typical American universities, not even typical Ivy League universities. They have tried to develop their strength. They have tried to cater to local conditions. And they all, of course, say they don't care about rankings, but that's a lie. Secondly, you might first think this is the difference between private universities and state universities. The difference is significant. I mean, 8 of those top universities are private and 4 are state. But I think it is less important than one would assume at first glance. These are universities that either for financial reasons or due to their prestige, think of Oxford and Cambridge, can take a relatively independent development, that can afford to have recruiting criteria that are their own. And I will interpret that. But I mean, in that sense, it is my impression maybe, I mean, I know that your colleagues at Cambridge and Oxford also have to fill out all these questionnaires about the efficiency and what does it do to profession. But it's difficult for me to imagine cultural politicians, even in the UK, picking fights in the public sphere with Oxford and Cambridge. I mean, so in that sense, but this would be an interesting point to discuss. I mean, a private university, there is no fight, and Schwarzenegger, for example, tried to confront the regents of the University of California, Berkeley, and kind of lost. No, I mean, he was, I mean, Schwarzenegger has a trauma with education. If one knows his biography, there are good Freudian reasons for that. He lost against Berkeley, and while Berkeley is our competitor, I would say, but you get my point. I mean, it is not state private. It's the possibility to develop the university according to your own criteria. Thirdly, in all those cases, and that is quite amazing, these are universities that emphasize, as if they all had read Humboldt, the unity of teaching and research. To give you 2 examples, Stanford professorial contracts do not speak of research. Legally speaking, we earn all our money by teaching. So my contract only speaks about teaching. And my salary development also mostly depends on teaching. So publish and perish, I think, is much more today a European principle than an American principle. All these universities, they all have Nobel laureates. None of them would allow their Nobel laureates not to teach. Yeah, I mean, if you are Nobel at Stanford, and we have, I'm very proud, 22 active Nobel. If you are Nobel at Stanford, there's no way that you don't teach. I mean, A, because this is why students come to Stanford. B, this is why parents pay tuition, and so forth and so forth. Yeah? If you are in Germany and have a Nobel, there are not many people having Nobel. You immediately promoted to Max Planck Institute, and no student will ever see you again. 4, only 2 of these top 12 institutions in the world, academic institutions, are in cities larger than 1 million. And most of them actually are in cities around 100,000, like Cambridge, Massachusetts, like Palo Alto, and so forth and so forth. I will come back to that, but it seems to confirm this romantic motif that Martin Heidegger cherished so much, that the best thought is done in the provinces. And I believe that's true, but I'll come back to that point. Finally, I asked my RA, can you figure out what institutions among those 12 have risen the most in the past 20 years, and that was truly interesting. They are technical universities that have humanities. So the ETH Zurich has risen a lot. Stanford is not officially a TU, as you say in Germany, but Stanford is de facto. I mean, Silicon Valley would not have come out of Stanford without Stanford not emphasizing engineering, but we have if you discount myself, I think very, very good humanities today. That has changed in the past 25 years. And this, I mean, once again, a university, most of them are called technical universities, like Caltech, like MIT, but this type of university is the one that has risen the most. And Stanford has risen from worldwide 10 to now 2, 3, 1 sometimes in the present. And this was surprising for me, I didn't expect that. Okay, now, how can we interpret that? Briefly. In the first place, and this is an important answer and something universities administrators should think about, if the strongest universities in the world are those that had the possibility to follow idiosyncratic development, that means that we should forget about the idea of what is the best university. There is no blueprint for the best university. So to apply it locally, you should think about what is the full potential of the University of Sheffield? How can we use certain Sheffield regional possibilities? How can we cater to the students who are interested in Sheffield and so forth, and develop that? And should not try to become whatever you may want to become, Oxbridge or University of Manchester. I mean, not that I had the impression you want to, but this is important. You develop your local possibilities because there is no university in general. Secondly, this independence from state-imposed criteria allows the top universities in the world to recruit students and faculty under intellectual criteria. Yeah, we do affirmative action at Stanford very strongly. I mean, for example, the proportion of African American students at Stanford is 4 times the proportion in demographics of California. But we do not do so because we want to do social charity. We do so because we think our student body gets better doing that. The same with faculty. I mean, okay, I'm stating the obvious, but it is important. In 27 years and being on many research committees at Stanford, I've never heard that it is an obligation of gender politics to recruit, for example, a young woman from Vienna for a newly created chair. I'm very proud, for medieval Persian literature, Hafiz and things like that. No, we just think she is the best, and then it is worth bringing her from Vienna and the complicated family situations and so forth and so forth. So I think this intrinsic criteria, yeah, you do not have selection criteria that are charity, social politics, numbers that you have to fulfill, but you recruit in the way that you get the best student body, the intellectually best student body, and you get the intellectually best body of faculty. What is good about this unity of teaching and research is obvious. It means it will not be allowed to the top researchers, the top professors to depart. Yeah, we had actually an interesting case, a Nobel last year. Zuthoff is a Stanford professor who won his Nobel at Stanford. He still has a German passport. He was immediately offered the directorship for Max Planck Institute in Germany. And much higher salary than at Stanford. And then the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung interviewed why he stayed at Stanford. I said, because I wouldn't have students in Germany. I think this was a very remarkable and very good answer. Now, why not in big cities? I mean, some reasons are absolutely obvious. Big cities absorb a lot of time. Big cities absorb a lot of time. You know, if you have to go from where you're living, let's say to King's College in London, that absorbs a lot of time, more than walking from your college to the classroom at Cambridge or Oxford. There's also, and Humboldt talks about that, a certain mental dispersion. Yeah? I mean, people who are living in Berlin, if they like classical music, the program in classical music is so good they get antsy every night about what they're missing. Yeah? And they have 7 or 6 days per week you have to listen to classical music, and it's wonderful. But it doesn't help your doctoral dissertation. I mean, I tend to tell my students, graduate student life is monastic life, and monastic life can be sexy. I mean it. But also, and I think this is important, whether you have planned a campus or not, I think universities in small cities tend to create a campus feeling in the American sense. And what I want to emphasize is tend to create an atmosphere of teaching in real presence, I mean, seminars where you can sit around a table. Yeah, seminars where it doesn't really matter whether you stop, at 6 o'clock sharp. And I think this real presence teaching situation seems to be, nobody's ever talked about it, but according to these statistics, seems to be a condition of excellence. But the most enigmatic, the most interesting point is, why would universities, technical universities, in their name that include humanities, why would they have risen the fastest? There's no standard answer, but I can start with a quote from the Stanford president, the outgoing Stanford president, John Hennessy, like the cognac or like the Irish name Hennessy, who is a world-class computer scientist. He was the famous advisor of the Google founders, who encouraged the Google founders not to graduate from Stanford because they had the good idea about the search engine. And John Hennessy is a very strong supporter of the humanities. And he was recently asked in an interview by the Wall Street Journal, would you abandon the humanities if the enrollment would go towards zero, which comparatively it does. It will never be zero, but it's worldwide going down. Enrollment in humanities. And I said, by no means. And I said, why? And then he gave this very simple answer in Californese, which I think is a good answer, and said, the humanities are the intellectual ring of a university, or universities would not be intellectual places without the humanities. So that's a starting point. But why are technical universities with humanities intellectually strong? Here's my hypothesis. I think, above all and in the first place, because they produce, non-programmatically, a cohabitation of three very different intellectual, and you might even want to say epistemological styles. Let me give you an example. If you have engineering and you have the humanities, you always have the sciences already. And the sciences, epistemologically speaking, are, in the most classical Western epistemological paradigm, and that is what Heidegger would have called Vorhanden, present at hand, subject-object, with mathematics. Heidegger characterized that polemically. They draw a mathematical curtain between nature and ourselves. But I'm not saying that in a critical sense. This is the German concept of Wissenschaft. Yeah? You stand outside something, you observe that objectively, and it becomes, the more mathematics you use, the more objective it is. So that is one epistemological style. If you have at the same time engineering, which not all universities have, you have a different epistemological style there. You have mathematics too in engineering. Engineers cannot do well without math. But I think you have a relationship to the world of objects that would rather be a ready-to-hand relationship. You don't have that distance. This is it is so application-oriented that you don't even have to speak about application-orientedness. So this is, I think, between engineering and the science, there are two very, very different intellectual styles. I would say the humanities, at their best, also have this ready-to-hand relationship. Yeah? If you recite a poem in a classroom and speak about it, it should not be completely clinically outside. Russian formalists were dreaming of that, but I think this was not a good dream. And they're certainly not mathematically oriented. So this is yet again a different intellectual style. And I don't want to say that there are but three epistemological styles. What I want to say, interpreting this result that the technical university with humanities have risen the first, if the humanities cultivate a simultaneity of different intellectual styles, so they're all in the same institution, and you do not let the technical university branch off or the humanities branch off, I think that is the strength of the university as an institution. I will come back to this motif by a philosopher that both Henk and I like, Niklas Luhmann, of the university producing complexity, producing intellectual complexity. Just an illusion, I will not develop that. The same would be true for temporalities. Yeah, the temporality of the classical science is indeed eternity. Sounds like theology, but Newtonian science wants to produce results that are eternal. Today people have some doubts about that, but I think this is still the dominant temporality. The temporality of engineering is completely different. It's application oriented. As my computer science students at Stanford say, they want their programs to run. And when their programs run and they have sold the app, they're no longer very interested. They write the next program. It's a completely different temporality. Whereas our temporality, humanities, is self-reflexive, meaning that we do not only operate under certain conditions of temporality that we refer to as history, capital H, we think about that. This is part of what we're doing. Yeah? It's not better or worse than the others, but you could also say there are three very different temporalities operating at a university that does humanities, engineering, and the sciences. And once again, this is not a holy trinity. I'm just saying it is about the task of the universities to produce complexity. This brings me, I'm doing okay. I mean, I don't know whether I'm doing okay.
Otherwise I will start making impatient noises.
No, that's why I look at you. Second part, Wilhelm von Humboldt. In the first place, these rankings, I'm almost tempted to say, not to say seem to prove, they prove that Humboldt continues to be right about one very basic thing, namely that what he called the unity of teaching and research, the Einheit von Lehre und Forschung, is successful until the present day. And it is not naive to believe that you should cultivate that. It is naive to separate them. Yeah? So in that sense, I think there's a lot of talking, especially in Germany. There's something that is kind of sympathetic that people call neo-Humboldtianism in the US. So administrators talk a lot about neo-Humboldtianism. Going back to Hannah Arendt, whom they want to stylize as an American professor, although she never got tenure at the University of Chicago. But anyway, so yes, this is why I talk about Humboldt, because I do think there's an agenda there. So this is not just saying, oh, what beautiful ideas. The text I'm referring to, some of you know that text, is the Memorandum towards a foundation of a university at Berlin, the today Humboldt University. It was never meant to be published by Humboldt. These were notes who were discovered in the late 19th century and then published. If you've never read the text, I strongly recommend it to you. I mean, it is in the first place, I do not know any better text about the university even today. In the second place, if you read German, it is among the most beautiful German prose I've ever read. Absolutely. To look more progressive politically than I am, I would say second only to Karl Marx, who I think is another fantastic author of German prose. Okay, now I want to highlight 3 points in Humboldt's memorandum. Of course, there are more topics. In the first place, and he insists probably too radically, Humboldt says universities should not be institutions of transmission of knowledge. Universities should only be institutions that are about tackling open questions. I give you the quote, I mean, and I concede this is probably too much for today, but it is interesting nevertheless. He says, it belongs to the idiosyncrasies of the higher scientific institutions, and he means universities, that they deal with their task only if the problems are not solved yet. They always stay in a reflection of research, while or whereas the Gymnasien, die Schulen, are the institution that transmits knowledge that is already ready and closed. I mean, this is too radical, certainly, but it can be turned polemically against a now prevailing conception and idea that you measure the quality of universities only by their contribution to professional education. And I'm not saying that only for the humanities. I think this is equally true for engineering, equally true for science, and so forth. Secondly, and I will not give you a quote here, but this is very remarkable because Humboldt was writing the text when he was Staatssekretär in the Prussian state of then very short-lived in his life, but he was the Minister of Culture, so to speak, the Minister of Education in Prussia at that time. And as a Minister of Education, he formulates the following: it is the obligation of the state, capital S, to fund universities. He used this old-fashioned Latin word alimentieren, give them food. It is the obligation of the universities, of the state, to alimentieren the universities, but it would be counterproductive to the state to ever formulate any expectations about the university. Now that sounds surprising. Yeah, no, great. I thought you would like it. Why would it be counterproductive? Because once the state only says, I want this question answered, they reduce the effect of innovation. Yeah. From the moment on that you formulate expectation, you direct research. And the strength of the university is precisely to come up with problems, not only with solutions, with problems that nobody had anticipated. This is one of this, towards the end of this 15-page memorandum, and I think it's memorable. But my favorite passage, and I will translate again, is the passage where Humboldt is asking himself, and this is a favorite word in this memorandum, where the intellectual energy, and he says Energie, and Energion is one of his favorite words anyway, where the intellectual energie of the university, the energy, comes from. And this is very moving and something we should take very seriously. Today I give you first my version and then I will translate Humboldt. He says, it has to do with the contiguity, the cohabitation, we might say, of the different tonalities of intellectual enthusiasm between the older and the younger generation. So it is precisely because a professor gets excited about a new equation, about an old poem, about a new computer program, he gets excited in a way that's different from the students. This is why, and this is again an argument of complexity, the universities are the place that produces intellectual energy. Is that clear as a principle? And I give you Wilhelm von Humboldt, sounds too American to be tolerable, but I mean here is an ad hoc translation of this passage. He says, the relationship between teacher and student is therefore radically different from the prior relationship, that would be the gymnasium relationship. Yeah? In the gymnasium, of course there's also an age difference, but it doesn't matter. And he says, at the university, you cannot say that the teacher is there for the students. That is very, very interesting. They are both there. They are simultaneously there in the interest of knowledge production. My point. So, and then he says and explains, they are both there in the interest of knowledge production. The success of the professor's activity depends on the presence, and I think he means real presence, as you guys are present for me here, depends on the presence of the students, and without their presence wouldn't be equally fortunate. A good professor, if no students would gather around him, and I think it's correct if I only say him because there were no female professors in 1810, a good professor, if the students do not gather around him, would go and seek students, would go to invite students. And then comes this beautiful sentence, I'll read it first in German. Sie aufsuchen, um dann zu ihnen näher zu kommen, durch die Verbindung der Geübten, aber eben darum auch leichter einseitigen und schon weniger lebhaften Kraft, mit der schwächeren und noch parteiloser nach allen Richtungen mutig hinstrebenden. This is the simultaneity of a well-exercised, but therefore easily being one-sided and sometimes less vital intellectual power. That's the professor. He's very exercised, very seasoned, but a little bit weak at age 68. And sometimes maybe too convinced that he's right. And at the same time, the weaker, more centrifugal, but more courageous intellectual enthusiasm of the student. And it's an absolutely fantastic description. And I hope you agree with me, we should not say that this has no normative power today. I think this is a very, very good description, the blueprint almost, of what the university can be today.
Seth, can I move you along a little bit, time-wise?
So how much do you give me still?
10, 15 minutes?
15 is
that
easy.
okay?
Yeah. Now, maybe you look a little bit more pumpy. And then I mean, not your looks. You look at me. Okay. Now, what could be the specific contribution of the humanities? In the first place, once again, I insist on what I said at the beginning, this is not about legitimation of the humanities. The humanities are in trouble. They are, I think, largely in self-imposed trouble, but ideally, what could they contribute towards Humboldt in a way? Yeah, I mean, towards this situation. And I mean, once again, I want to insist, I have the impression that these top 12 universities that I was referring to, if you try to characterize them, they are more Humboldtian than any other universities, and it's a good thing. And you could also say, what I'm trying to do in these remaining 15 minutes is to interpret this Californese quote of my university president, the humanities make the intellectual ring of the university. The university cannot be an intellectual place without the humanities. Let us approach this problem historically. What have the humanities been doing traditionally? And then I will try to develop in the last 7 minutes what they can do today. My presupposition, my hypothesis here is that the humanities, as a programmatic cluster of disciplines separated from the sciences, have only been existing since the late 19th century, 1890s, early 20th century, time of foundation of the University of Sheffield, time of foundation of Stanford, 1891, but that there have been humanities avant la lettre. Not forever, not since Plato and Aristotle, but I would say since Romanticism. I think there have been disciplines who have then been integrated in this cluster of humanities, of Geisteswissenschaften, since the early 19th century. So I think that's the starting point of the humanities. Of course, there have been people philosophizing, people thinking about literature, etc., but they were not within the academic institution. Now, here's my hypothesis about why this gets going in the early 19th century. And it has to do with a social problem, a social tension that did not literally exist before. And this is the tension between the everyday experience in society, what you live in society on a daily basis, and this is the innovation, a normative image of society. Only since the bourgeois revolutions, only post-bourgeois revolutions, is there a normative image of society which is a promise to the citizen. Yeah? I mean, if you haven't had a bourgeois revolution, there is no normative image of society. So this is the big innovation. And you could document historically that from the early 19th century on, with the first bourgeois revolution in this country, in the United States, in France, these are the three first countries, people are complaining and saying, I am a citizen now, but what I have been promised is not being kept. Yeah, even in America, very early, in the 1780s, 1790s already. Now, my thesis is that there is a social dimension emerging that has not existed before, not programmatically, that becomes the solution of this problem, takes care of this problem, and that's what we call leisure or pastime. Now, not leisure as pastime as a class privilege, otium in the aristocracy. No, leisure is something that everybody's supposed to enjoy. Because leisurely activities, by compensation, allowing you in leisure time to be what you're promised to be, a citizen, when in reality you cannot be a citizen, or by reconciliation, trying to convince you that the tension is not so big, tries to ease this tension. And I think this is one of the functions of the emerging humanities. For example, to develop certain pedagogies of reading, if you think of people like Matthew Arnold or the Grimm brothers, that this function will be fulfilled. Now, mind you, Matthew Arnold, the Grimm brothers were not thinking about this function. I think this is our retrospective reconstruction of the situation. And there is another function that the humanities assume from the early 19th century on, and this is the function to illustrate the normative horizon of society. To illustrate the normative horizon of society. Famous quote by Matthew Arnold, we can use the best literature from all times, from all nations, to show really what's good morality. Yeah? In countries that did not have a bourgeois revolution, like Germany, like Italy, like Spain, you go back to the past to make the past normative. That's what the Grimm brothers do. German medieval becomes normative for what the German nation is supposed to be, and that is German Romanticism. But, and this is my main point, in this sense, assuring this easing the tension between normative image and everyday experience in society, but also in illustrating what society should be, in this sense, the 19th century is the great age of the humanities, the golden age of the humanities, although the humanities avant la lettre, there was no word, Geisteswissenschaften, there was not much talking about the humanities and arts, in the sense that the German literary critic Wolfgang Iser once described in the following way, which I think is genius. During the 19th century, the bourgeois century, culture takes over a transcendental function until then fulfilled by religion. And if culture takes over the function of religion, think of Richard Wagner in the late 19th century, then the humanities become their theologies. Yeah, I think this, for me, this is perfectly convincing that humanities in the 19th century function as the theologies. Now, this enters into a crisis, and this crisis becomes the reason for the humanities being formulated as a cluster. Because if you focus on the main movement, and that would be at the Humboldt University, and that would be Dean Dilthey, the philosopher Wilhelm Dilthey as the dean, in the late 19th century, this function of a normative horizon of society, something like that existing, is no longer unquestioned. Think of people like Friedrich Nietzsche, I mean, who after all was a professor, but who wrote many books making fun of that pretext that there would be something like a normative horizon of society. And secondly, it becomes also problematic for the universities, to compete with the sciences. The late 19th century, early 20th century is the century of the greatest admiration of the sciences, the natural sciences, and the humanities cannot compete. And I think this is, as you would say in Austrian German, eine Sezession. They separate themselves from the competition with the sciences. And that means that the new humanities, the programmatic humanities of the 20th century, are born under a birth trauma. They are born under the birth trauma of a loss of reality. Yeah, I think this is the reason why so many professors of literature want to be political, want to be politicians, because we always feel we have to be closer to reality. I will not go into any detail because I can see Henk beginning to frown and come to this is still in my third part, but my point would be, my polemical point would be, that there is no point in trying to pursue this program, in trying to pursue a program, as Dilthey is saying, where we continue to provide a normative image of society. I don't think we should attempt to be specialists for ethics, for morality. I feel any other citizen has as much a claim to formulate moral rules as I have, or maybe more. But I don't think because I'm professor of literature and close to retirement, I'm specifically good in formulating how people should lead their lives, which would be in the spirit of the old humanities. Now, what can the humanities then be? I'm going to take another 7 minutes and we'll explain 3 concepts. And the concept will be riskful thinking, contemplation, and imagination. These will be my 3 programmatic concepts for the humanities in the end of the lecture. What do I mean by riskful thinking? By riskful thinking, I would like to recycle an idea once again of this. I mean, he was officially a sociologist, but I think he was really a philosopher. I always think he was ironic when he was calling himself sociologist, Niklas Luhmann, who says normally the function of social systems is reduction of complexity. Yeah, you have an overwhelming complexity in your surroundings, and a system reduces them. Yeah, among all the possibilities to run economy, a specific economic system selects certain sets of possibilities. It says, with the exception of very few social systems, there are very few social systems that increase complexity. And that is my first point, and this is barely quoting Luhmann. I think the university, and the humanities in specific, should assume the task of making our image of the world more complex, including more complicated. I think we should not try to do problem solution in the humanities. I think it is our task to make the worldview more complex. We should not prescribe people how to lead their lives, for example. I mean, to quote it in Californese again, we should enable people to think outside the box. That's what we are good at. Now, why do I call this riskful thinking? Because creating more complexity is normally not good for the flux of social life. To give you one example, I mean, Henk is now looking a little bit concerned because it's getting long, but I could also think this is because he has a stomach ache, and it gets worse and worse, and we call the emergency, and the doctor says, Professor de Berg, this is appendicitis on the verge of peritonitis, you have to go to the hospital, and before they give you the anesthesia, they said, you're so lucky, Professor Berg, because you will be the first patient on which I try a new access to the appendix. And that would be riskful thinking. That would be thinking outside the box, but Henk would not like it. And liking Henk as much as we do, we wouldn't like that either. At the same time, you want an institution where this can happen, where you can do this experiment. And I think the university should be this institution. I mean, not university hospital specifically, but university should be this institution. Humanities should be this institution, not thinking about appendicitis. And this is why, this is my first thesis, I would like to invert the value of a description of the university that is traditionally negative, and this is ivory tower. I think it is good for us to be an ivory tower. It is good for us to be separated from the immediate application, at least for the humanities, because only under this condition can we afford to practice riskful thinking without any immediate risk for people who are concerned with what we're doing. Is that clear? Maybe in the question and answer, I can give you an example about riskful thinking in the humanities that I find moving every time that I'm remembering it. It was at the University of Siegen. I think you were there when it happened. This discussion, I mean, ask me, I would love to tell the anecdote, but as I now do not know whether Henk is concerned with time or has appendicitis.
I'm concerned with time.
Oh, are you? You never know. I'm the son of two surgeons. So. Okay.
That's very encouraging. Thank you.
Okay. My next point would be that I think in this spirit, riskful thinking, increasing complexity, we should at least experimentally try and stop to speak of research in the humanities. I think research in the humanities, I mean, in Stanford we only use it for our research accounts. Every faculty has, depending on his or her negotiations, a certain amount of money you can spend on research, on your work. But do we really do research? I mean, this is an invitation to think along with me. I recently am experimenting with contemplation. I know it has a highly theological connotation, which is not exactly what I want to say, but what do I mean when I say contemplation? I mean, trying to describe more precisely what we are doing in the humanities. I mean that we concentrate on certain phenomena, that we reiterate our concentration, we come back to certain phenomena, and each time that we come back to those phenomena, we make them more complex. And this complexification is two things. It is, in the first place, endless. I mean, there is no end, and now I have said everything I can possibly say about this painting, or I can possibly say about this novel, I can possibly say about this Platonic dialogue. It is endless, and it is also increasingly reflexive. I think coming back to previous interpretations, previous analysis that we've done, for example, of a painting or text, we realize how our intellectual styles may be different from other people's intellectual styles, so that in the act of contemplation, the humanities can actively contribute to making the university a place where different intellectual styles can be in cohabitation. So you see, riskful thinking, contemplation, and how does imagination come into play? And when I say imagination, I warn you, I don't mean literary imagination. Yeah? I say imagination in the sense you say, oh, this is an imaginative person, makes imaginative contributions. I mean the following. I think we are in a situation today where what everyday society used to be under Western conditions a field of contingents. I mean, most of the phenomena we are confronted with are polyperspectival. We can use them, we can interpret them in different ways. And they are between one cushion of necessity. Certain things cannot be changed, they are necessarily so. And some other things we can imagine, but we used to believe we can never make them real, they are impossible. So, field of contingents between necessity and impossibility. And I think we find ourselves in a situation where these cushions of necessity and impossibility are melting down, partly under the impact of these huge numbers of these huge quantities that electronic computation can process. To give you two examples, being born into a sex, and I'm deliberately not saying gender, used to be fate. And used to be a necessity. It could be tragic, but there were people who believed that they were born in the wrong body, but you couldn't do anything about it. Now today, as you all know, and this is an enormous gain of freedom and fantastic, this is no longer fate. I mean, in a good health system, there are now methods, and I think they will be improved. On the other side, impossible. What used to be emblematically impossible? Eternal life. Most of you know that whether it will ever come true or not, eternal life today is a research assignment for medical schools. Yeah? Will it be possible with replacement of organs and so forth to achieve something? You can determine whether you want to live 35 or 3,500 years. Yeah? This is a situation, I think, of fantastic gains of freedom, but maybe also of an overwhelming complexity. Of an overwhelming complexity, of too much complexity. I think this is a situation, and this would be a longer argument, that explains why the burnout syndrome has become the most frequent disease today. This is just too much. Yeah? Too much of planning, too much of choice. And at the same time, we want to keep it. I'm not saying we have to reduce it. No. We want to keep that freedom. We want to keep this possibility. But it is too much. I think this is the situation that explains why today in societies there's such an enormous desire of what I call recycling, a metaphor from theology, a mystical body. This is nothing religious. Mystical bodies are people who love to be in a stadium with other people and don't want to be an individual. Mystical bodies, something very popular in Germany, are people who go to a public viewing. 2 million people around the Brandenburg Gate during the Soccer World Cup final of 2014, and we know that less of half of them were interested in football. They like to stand there with other people. Same is true for these open-air masses of the Pope. Less than half of the people who go there, and oftentimes it's more than 1 million people, know, if you forgive my language, I have a sympathy for, I'm an ex-Catholic and I have a sympathy for Catholic culture, but less than half of the people do not know what the hocus pocus is that this old man at the altar is doing. They like to be together with other people. Now, and this is my concluding reflection, this is scary somehow. I mean, on the one hand, if we are overwhelmed by complexity, if we are overwhelmed by possibilities, I think this makes it plausible why there is such a desire to be temporarily part of a mystical body. But if you imagine such a mystical body, what I call mystical bodies, especially if you're born in Germany and have a German accent, it makes you think of Nazi party rallies. It makes you think of undesirable things. At the same time, it's plausible. Now, we have no solution. We have no model to which we can go back. And I think these are situations, and I'm coming from an experience of the money in Moscow. We were discussing under Putin situations what could be a different type of sociability. I think this is a situation, this is not a historically unique situation, it's an example for a situation where humanists should use their imagination under epistemologically reflected conditions. So this is not literary imagination, this is not writing poems, but the power to imagine something. And I think there is no better place for the power to imagine something to emerge than a humanities seminar of 10 to 15 people, older style of intellect, younger style of intellect, sitting around a table. I thank you very, very much for your patience.
people have got to go, including for
Yeah.
childcare reasons. We will take literally 8 minutes of question and answers, and then I will stop. That's an absolute promise. Okay? This is a dictatorial decision on my part. So 8 minutes question and answers. Then we'll have a wine reception during which people can ask further questions of Zeb. So are there any questions that people may want to ask?
I'm
Yeah,
so thankful because nobody.
Go ahead.
But I didn't want to be the first one.
Why not?
Someone's got to be the first.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And just very quickly, the cohabitation of three epistemological style, I just wanted to ask whether there is anybody here in this room now from the sciences and engineering. Because you see, I think that it would be a great, it is a great image, but my sense is in Britain today that the cohabitation of epistemological studies and styles in the sense of contact between the humanities and the sciences is only via management bodies, that is in the sense of the scientific model of controlling and quantifying knowledge being imposed upon the humanities. Otherwise, we don't know what microbes are being grown in the next building. We don't care what they are. We would maybe like to care, but we don't, because we don't.
I mean, thank you. It's not so much about knowing about the microbes and then them knowing every Platonic dialogue. I mean, very few people have read every Platonic dialogue anyway. But it is more about cohabitation of styles, and even that doesn't happen very much. Yeah? I mean, it's a triumph sometimes. We are separated now. We have our own building, and then there is this word which I personally find very lame: interdisciplinarity. It's like chewing gum, right? I mean, there's no word there's no phrase where you cannot say interdisciplinary. Like in the 70s, social or social doesn't mean anything. But I give you an example, not from Stanford as normative, but which I find interesting. The literature departments at Stanford a couple of years ago were approached by computer science, who had this complete overload of majors. And imagine Stanford computer science, right? They said, our students are very, very good, but they're really bored in computer science. Could we introduce a major minor? And we have now major in computer science, and not everybody has to do major minor, but students can do major minor, can do major major. The minor is a box and can be any type of literature. It can be English literature, can be comparative literature, can be French, and so forth and so forth. It is a big hit in the first place. It brings us in the humanities, I don't know about the computer science, absolutely fantastic undergraduate students, I mean, who don't tell me about computer science. Occasionally they say something about that, but who have a different intellectual style. And that's what I mean. I mean, like yourself, I don't think that problem is resolved. But the university is good if it has this potential, and instead of separating and saying, you go to the technical university and you go to the humanities. I mean, today in a week I'm having a discussion with the president's office of the ETH, because they imagine they want to eliminate the humanities. And I wrote something in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung in Switzerland. I said, don't do that. It would be completely wrong. On the contrary, create not interdisciplinary programs, practical situations where you have people who participate in both intellectual styles. I mean, this is just one thing.
Put the absolutism on my part down to my Calvinist background, but I said 8 minutes, I'll stick to 8 minutes, so that gives us time for one more question. I know that's yeah, go ahead.
As a medievalist, so I'm not starting with Humboldt, but with the Middle Ages.
Great. I'm an ex-medievalist.
Yes, and community. I think you touched upon community. But,
yes, of course.
And in a sense, you said that also the best university, in a sense, that preserved that community.
I mean that.
Spirit, in a sense. What is also striking as a medievalist is how universities were able in the Middle Ages to accommodate foreign knowledge, and I mean religiously not assimilable in many ways, and also over the centuries basically to come to us as a form of community. We still have the monopoly of the degrees, etc., etc., and even the state has not been able to take it away from the universities. So I wondered if you would agree with the importance of the community.
No, absolutely. I mean, both in the sense of the nationes at the medieval university. This is where our concept of nation comes from. So that students with similar backgrounds are in similar dorms, one would say today. But also, I mean, there was no concept of a campus university. But if you imagine the situation on the Île de la Cité in the 12th century, let's say in times of Abélard, I mean, that's real presence, you know? And this is actually interesting to talk from different, we could say that the provocation of Abélard, as I'm talking Paris 12th century, was not so much the content of theology, he was thinking in a different way. And instead of eliminating him, they constantly had public disputes and disputations with Abélard. I mean, in a time that was, of course, compared to as very orthodox, but they did not say, oh, you have to branch off and you go to the University of Rennes, which of course didn't exist at that time. So it was a place of simultaneity of different styles, and this I think explains in a way no different from today why all of a sudden there was this explosive intellectual moment. If you read medieval theology, which means medieval philosophy, in Paris in the second half of the 12th century. Now, I do not think that institutions like Oxbridge have preserved that throughout the time. I do not think that the medieval university is a norm and a blueprint, but it is a very powerful argument, like the concept of mystical body that I'm taking out of medieval theology. Yeah, I mean, there are certain, let me call them in an old-fashioned way, values today that one has, and that could be mere closing statement. You have to recycle them against a certain grain of modernity. And that is, it is important to be in the same room, and this is why I was ending, so it is important to sit around the same table. That is not, you cannot do that electronically. Why exactly? Very difficult to say. I have no empirical proof, but I would be astonished if anybody here would not share this conviction that there is the situation of sitting around a table, a seminar situation, cannot be replaced by electronic communication.
I am fully aware that colleagues have further questions, but I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to ask those during the wine reception.
Do.
I just want to say thank you very much for your talk, which was I think was truly emblematic of the reflective powers of the humanities, and therefore in itself I think a great argument in favor of the humanities. So thank you very much.
Thank you.